We have Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith with us today. Dr. Smith is Associate Professor and Associate Chair in Duke's Department of History. And she teaches courses on the Civil Rights Movement, on Black Lives, on modern America, and history in fact and fiction. One of her recent books is Freedom Struggles, African Americans and World War I, which is a book that explores how African Americans worked through ideas of manhood, citizenship, and global encounter to pursue the Black freedom struggle during World War I and built the civil rights movement that followed. Her talk today, as I understand it, concerns that post-World War I period. The Red Summer of 1919 involved incidences of white supremacist terrorism and racial riots. It was sparked by tensions from the Great Migration of African Americans to the North and the demobilization of white and Black GIs after the war. And these violent incidences took place in more than 36 cities across the United States, including Chicago and the District of Columbia, as well as in one rural county in Arkansas. The death toll estimates up to 240 people. So Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith, we're eager to hear about the Red Summer of 1919.
Thank you, Dick. And thank all of y'all again for taking the time to attend in this strange form that attendance now takes my talk. Jane, can I ask you to give me the power to share screen?
I will try.
And then I am going to try to show you my PowerPoint presentation. If I make something very odd appear on your screen, please let me know, and we will abandon this exercise. So
you're showing up.
Okay. And you see right now, okay, this looks like it's going to work. You see something that says the Red Summer of 1919. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I see y'all in a little line on the side. So in classic historian form, this talk is about the Red Summer of 1919, but I'm actually going to roll us back a couple of years and begin in a moment a little bit before my stated beginning. I want to open with a scene from 2 summers earlier with the NAACP's silent protest parade, which was held on July 28, 1917, when nearly 10,000 African Americans paraded up New York's Fifth Avenue. Children came first, then women, then men, all of them in their Sunday best. Women and children were all in white as if they were attending a baptism. Men wore dark suits as if they were on their way to a funeral. They kept disciplined silence, but they carried placards that proclaimed in so many words that Black Lives Matter. This protest came in response to what we sometimes call a riot, but we should really think of as more of a pogrom in East St. Louis, Illinois, earlier that summer, and in response to spectacle lynchings in Memphis and Waco in the spring of 2017 and the fall of the previous year. One placard challenged their fellow Americans newly entered into a global conflict that their president, Woodrow Wilson, had labeled a war for democracy. It challenged those fellow Americans to make America safe for democracy as well. Other placards made explicit links between Black people's military service and the rights of citizenship so violently denied them. And they form an account of Black military service up through US entry into the Great War. One read, "We have fought for the liberty of white Americans in 6 wars. Our reward is East St. Louis." Another read, "The first blood of American independence was shed by a Negro, Crispus Attucks." Another read, 3,000 Negroes fought for American independence under George Washington. And another, we fought with Perry at Lake Erie. 12,000 of us fought with Jackson at New Orleans. 10,000 of us fought in the Spanish-American War. We helped to plant the flag in every American dominion. From Bunker Hill to Carrizal, we have done our bit. Another placard reiterated the tension and conundrum inherent in all of these moments of African Americans' military service. Patriotism and loyalty presuppose protection and liberty. Yet, as the NAACP staffers who organized the parade and the 10,000 Black folks who marched in it all knew well, government protection and the privileges of freedom, like liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness, remained elusive goals. So this scene sets up a few things for us. The centrality of the war to the events that followed, the expectations of that African Americans had going into and coming out of the war, the long and unceasing nature of Black freedom struggles. It also sets up us to sort of hear the story or some part of the Great Migration, and to have an eye to labor competition, which some of the troubles over labor competition are what spurred the East St. Louis riot in the first place. We can flash then from that 1917 scene ahead to 1919, the year of the Red Summer. It was a year of exalted ideals and dreams and potentials on the world stage, but in many American cities, there was a much darker daily reality. Poet James Weldon Johnson called it the Red Summer, the season of riots and racial massacres that surpassed anything the nation had seen since Reconstruction. More than 70 African Americans were lynched in 1919, at least 10 of them soldiers in uniform. A minimum of 35 riots occurred that summer and into the fall in cities like Longview, Texas, Charleston, South Carolina, Bisbee, Arizona, Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska. And note as I read these places off to you that they're not just Southern cities, although there are some Southern cities. They're not just Midwestern or Northern sites, right? These are happening all over the country. Perhaps the most infamous of those riots occurred in Washington, D.C. In June, Chicago, Illinois in July, and Elaine and Phillips County, Arkansas in September. And when I say, I'll keep saying riots just because it's the term I've been using for 25 odd years at this point. But it's important for us to keep in mind that when historians talk about riots, particularly in the pre-World War II period, we're not talking about things that look like Los Angeles in 1991 or Cincinnati in 2001. We're not talking about, although there is some element of destruction of property or looting, we're really talking about heirs to older riots like Atlanta in 1906 or East St. Louis, as I mentioned, in 1917. These were racial massacres compared by folks at the time to the pogroms of Jews in Eastern European ghettos. In the post-World War I period that we are talking about now, there's something new in the air. And that's Black people with expectations having risen from wartime service and their hearts broken from wartime abuse, who begin to defend themselves and even to fight back. So I've put up for you the famous sonnet by Claude Mckay, the Jamaican-born poet, with the piece that if you have a child or grandchild who's taken an AP US history class, I'm sure they had to learn or have recited to them the part that says, if we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock of our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die. Like men will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. Another thing that captures the spirit of this period is W.E.B. Du Bois's essay in The Crisis, which is the NAACP's monthly magazine, that I'm going to read to you in full because I think that Du Bois is one of the great prose stylists of the modern era. And because it tells you the story in some ways of the Black experience during the World War and captures the spirit of many African Americans in the post-war. He wrote in the special issue devoted to returning soldiers in May of 1919, an editorial that says, "We are returning from war. The crisis and tens of thousands of Black men were drafted into a great struggle. For bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us in humanity, and against the threat of German race arrogance, we fought gladly and to the last drop of blood. For America and her highest ideals, we fought in far-off hope.
Has to be.
For the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington," by which he meant Woodrow Wilson's administration, right? "For the dominant Southern oligarchy entrenched in Washington, we fought in bitter resignation. For the America that represents and gloats in lynching, disfranchisement, caste, brutality, and devilish insult, for this, in the hateful upturning and mixing of things, we were forced by vindictive fate to fight also. But today we return. We return from the slavery of uniform, which the world's madness demanded us to don, to the freedom of civil guard. We stand again to look America squarely in the face and call a spade a spade. We sing, this country of ours, despite all its better souls have done and dreamed, is yet a shameful land. We return from fighting. We return fighting. Make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why." Both of these, Mckay's poem and Du Bois's editorial, were written for and about Black freedom struggles after World War I, but they don't speak for Black folks alone. They articulate a focus and a resolve common to all sorts of people who sought to change the world in the wake of World War I. So how do we get to this point in 1919 when the country is about to explode? There are two contexts that I think are hugely important for understanding the events of that summer. One, sort of if we think about overseas or international events, is the context of the First World War. The other domestically is the context of the Great Migration. With the World War, there's a lot that we could talk about. Part of it is about the way in which labor tensions and labor organizing increased during the war, in part because immigration cut off, or the war cut off immigration from Europe, which put American workers, Black and white, in a better bargaining position, right? There's this huge mobilization for war, but fewer people to actually do the jobs. So you see people striking for better pay. You see companies looking to Black folks as strike breakers. This is one of the things that'll be the engine of the Great Migration. And you see the tension between those things play out in the streets of Northern and Midwestern cities. But also, you know, we tend to think of labor as an urban story, but labor also drives the violence in Elaine and Phillips County, Arkansas. I'm going to talk about it a little bit out of order. It's the last of the riot. Well, I mean, it is the last of the big riots of the Red Summer. That said, I think we could probably talk about the kind of violent outbreaks of the Red Summer dribbling over into the following year. But Elaine is the last big one. It's a tremendously important story, and I don't know it well enough to do it justice. I would suggest, just to give you a list of things to do, so long as you can take advantage of Zoom, that you might ask Nan Woodruff, who's a professor at Penn State and the author of a wonderful book on the Arkansas Delta called American Congo, to Zoom in sometime to talk to you about Elaine. But Elaine is stunning. And if you don't know any of the backstory, let me give you a little bit about it. in the fall of 1919, a group of Black sharecroppers met at a church to talk about forming a sharecroppers and tenant farmers union. As I said, there was a lot of labor organizing energy burbling around during these World War I years. Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers, all sharecroppers and tenant farmers were being hideously taken advantage of, and understood that they were in a decent bargaining position, in part because the Great Migration was emptying laborers out of the southern countryside and southern cities. But when they met in this secret meeting, or in a sort of meeting that they were trying to keep under wraps so as not to antagonize their landlords to form a union, a group of white men advanced on the church and fired on the church to break up the meeting. In this case, the farmers fired back at them, which then provoked the governor to send in 500 soldiers from nearby Camp Pike, Arkansas, to retaliate, to quell what they began narrating as an insurrection. What ended up happening was a massacre. So this is known in many circles as the Elaine Massacre. There was a sort of indiscriminate killing of Black women, of Black men, and of Black children. But it was framed in the coverage in the white papers as African Americans' fault and as African American plotting. The few white men who were killed were highlighted. The Black folks who were killed were sort of played down, and a score, well, maybe about 10 Black folks were prosecuted for killing in a case that would make its way to the Supreme Court and give us the ruling on Moore versus Dempsey that sort of ruled in favor of the Black defendants whose due process was violated. So it was a ruling under the 14th Amendment. It's a much longer, dramatic, bloody, and terrifying story than what I'm giving you here. Like I said, I say go to Nan and have her talk to you about it. I will go back to the sort of big heading that I actually meant to do this under, which is to say that the context of World War I did a few things, right? So there's labor tensions, labor organizing, and then even more, there's the sense that during the war, white soldiers who were committed to Jim Crow wanted to make sure that wanted to tamp down Black expectations. So there are many stories during World War I of white soldiers fighting their fellow Black soldiers and policing their behavior more intensely and kind of with more devotion than they prosecuted the war itself. This led to race riots in France and in French cities, in American camps, and that tension spilled over domestically at war's end. Basically, the defenders of Jim Crow wanted to make sure that the war was not a asset or a benefit to the Black freedom struggle. So you see in Pittsburgh, for example, Pennsylvania, the Klan printing notices and posting them around Black neighborhoods that read, "The war is over, Negroes, stay in your place, and if you don't, we'll put you there." Or in the Charleston riot in May, you see tensions from the war spill over after an African-American pool player got in a fight with a white man in a pool room and shot him. Hundreds of white sailors ran riot through the city. The mob, led by those sailors, destroyed Black-owned businesses and killed 2 African Americans, one of whom they shot after snatching them off of a streetcar. And this is something that you'll see over and over again. Whatever begins the riot, and often it's either, an individual fight, a claim of crime, something like that. When those riots grow bigger, when they spill out, what ends up getting targeted are sites of Black business, sites of Black politics, sites of Black community. You see the sort of translation from whatever spark to something that serves Jim Crow by undercutting symbols and agents of Black accomplishment and Black advancement. So if World War I is doing some work, then so too is the Great Migration. This I was just pausing to, all right, I included because I wanted to show the way that African Americans used the war, the conversation around war crimes, the rhetoric about, making the world safe for democracy and what have you, to shed a lens, or to kind of turn the lens back on the US and what was happening there. So in this particular cartoon in the Chicago Defender, which is the big Black newspaper, they're comparing the Armenian genocide to the lynching of African Americans in the US. But the slide, we go from that to something I think sort of more beautiful and hopeful. The slide from Jacob Lawrence's migration series, which he painted in 40 and 41, but as a depiction of the Great Migration. Lawrence himself, a child of the Great Migration. There's like 61 panels of this, but Jacob Lawrence is from South Carolina and Virginia, moved north in the Great Migration to Pennsylvania, and eventually on to Harlem. For the Northern riots, especially, the Great Migration is a big part of the story. It's something that Elaine Massacre called, she was one of the architects of the Harlem Renaissance, something akin to a spiritual emancipation. It came in 3 distinct waves, 1915 to 1910, and then a huge one after World War II. But our focus in this talk is on the period around World War I and into the 1920s, when between 1916 to 1930, 1 million Black folks left the South at a rate of 16,000 people per month, or 500 people per day. They went in families and in groups. They went in individually. They went in carts, boats, cars, trains. Between 1910 and 1920 alone, the Black population in New York increased 66%. In Chicago, it rose 148%. And in Detroit, it rose 614%. This would create a huge number of tensions. Again, labor competition, African Americans being viewed as scabs. In fairness to the African Americans who were strikebreakers, they were often not allowed into the unions in the first place. So their only way of working in these factories would have been as strikebreakers. But the other thing that it does is to put pressure on housing and residential areas, because of racial covenants, racially restrictive covenants, and general practice, African Americans were limited to certain portions of these cities where they moved. Think Black Bottom in Detroit, or Bronzeville, or the Black Belt in Chicago. Harlem too, although Harlem is slightly different in part because it's a deliberately constructed place where real estate developers bought up property and rented to Black people because there were so few places available to them elsewhere. So the Great Migration brings folks, oh, my husband has brought me coffee, which is very sweet. This is the nice thing about doing talks from home. He's like, but so you have the Great Migration pulling people into cities. You have the tension between white workers and Black workers, like in the context of the labor struggles of World War I. You have, and I won't talk about this as much, but that many of the workers who are in these cities, who are living in the neighborhoods that African American influx is putting pressure on, are themselves ethnic white people in a period when their whiteness is conditional, right? So there's a book by Tom Guglielmo called White on Arrival, about Chicago and the ways in which Italians became white and the circumstances around which that happened. You have these stories told too about other kinds of ethnic whites. And so while they're not as white as sort of Northern and Western European folks, or sort of older stock immigrants, they are certainly not Black, and that distinction is incredibly important to them, and policing that distinction is important to them. So some of the tensions in these neighborhoods are about that as well. I want to actually give you a sense, because I'm trying to be mindful of time so that you guys can ask me questions. I want to give you a sense of what these riots were like. And I think I'm going to do that by talking specifically about Washington, D.C. I think Chicago is probably the most famous of the summer's riots. It's also one, I mean, DC has a lot of good coverage that's easily accessible as well. But for Chicago, I'd actually recommend just looking. You can get copies of The Crisis on the internet. I think Google Books has scanned many of them. But there's a document written by Walter White, who would go on to be the head of the NAACP in later years, called Chicago and Its 8 Reasons, where he goes in and sort of breaks down many of the causes of the Chicago riot. And I sort of start there if you want to read that. So I'm going to talk to you about DC instead. Also, honestly, because given the events that opened this year, it's important for us to have other contexts for white mobs on the street, and to know some of that history as well. So on July 19th, 1919, several hundred soldiers, sailors, and Marines joined with more than 1,000 white civilians to launch attacks on African Americans. They were fired up by reports of a Negro crime wave, and purported attacks on white women. Fired up by this, you can see, I say the Washington Post takes responsibility for stoking the riot. A lot of this reporting came from the Washington Post. Some of it came from the Washington Times. But the Post actually published an article within the past couple of years where it sort of takes ownership and sort of traces the way in which their reporting inflamed the rioting in this period. Mobs went after African Americans in the streets, in parks, and on public transportation, dragging men off of streetcars, just as rioters had done in Charleston the month before. Streetcars are often sites of racial conflict. Historian Robin Kelly actually has an article about streetcar fights during World War II, where he describes streetcars as moving theaters of confrontation, and meaning theaters in the dual sense of places where you're performing a certain kind of racial politics, but then also sites of conflict. You see that here. Certainly. This riot lasted for 4 days, over the course of which, according to reports, women were beaten, men shot, and even youngsters hurled from the windows of moving cars. In one white district, 4 white men ripped the clothes off of a Black woman and made her walk naked out of their neighborhood. Similar violence was directed at Black men as well. All of this, the headlines in the Black paper, the Washington Bee, observed was, quote, "the colored Americans' reward for fighting for world democracy." A group of prominent Black professionals, including William Houston, who was Charles Hamilton Houston, the great lawyer's father, approached DC leaders, government leaders, to protect African Americans. But many everyday African Americans didn't wait for and didn't believe that help would be coming from the municipal government. Instead, in riot besieged districts, they took up arms to protect themselves and to fight back. So of the 15 people killed or critically wounded during the riots, at least 10 of them were white. Messengers on bicycles rode through Black neighborhoods, warning folks when white mobs were approaching. Some folks would then stay home to protect their property from marauders, but others took to the streets, armed, in the words of the Black weekly, the Washington Eagle, to the teeth. Often Black Washingtonians targeted soldiers and the police. 4 Black men fired on the entrance of the Naval Hospital the day after white soldiers instigated the first round of shooting. That night, authorities had to call in the cavalry on an African-American man in the northwest section of town who was leaning out of the window shooting at white soldiers. The cavalry rode up to the apartment building with sabers drawn, but the shooter had disappeared out his back door. Elsewhere in Northwest, a young African-American woman held police off at gunpoint while she fired off rounds out the window of her second floor apartment. When a policeman forced his way into her second floor apartment, she shot him before other officers could subdue her. In many parts of town, the Washington Bee crowed, "Ethiopia reigned supreme." Eventually, President Woodrow Wilson called in troops to quell the fighting. And as I said, it's one of the few riots of that summer where Black and white casualties were roughly equal. Chicago would follow a week later. Riot kicked off when a Black boy swam into the white side of Lake Michigan, a segregated swimming hole in Lake Michigan, and was stoned by the white beachgoers on the beach. That fighting spilled over, lasted several days. It's another instance in which African Americans resolved to defend themselves. In this case, there was a Black National Guard unit, the 8th Illinois National Guard, which went back to its armory and gathered weapons and posted themselves on the street corners in Black neighborhoods in defensive positions. So using their military training in that instance to quell the mobs. I don't know if I included pictures from Chicago. Yeah, so the pictures from Chicago are actually really hard, I think, to look at, often kind of burning bodies or beaten bodies. There were, I think 23 Black folks killed in the Chicago riot. These numbers are all estimates because it's hard to verify. There are a lot of people who get overlooked. 15 white folks, there are about 540 people who are injured and upwards of 1,000 people who are displaced. In response to all of these riots, the Chicago Defender wrote, "America is known the world over as the land of the lyncher and mobocrat." For years, she has been sowing the wind, and now she is reaping the whirlwind. The Black worm has turned. A race that has furnished hundreds of thousands of the best soldiers that the world has ever seen is no longer content to turn the left cheek when smitten upon the right. So again, it's a sort of rhetorical invocation of the new Negro, right, as a sort of more militant defender of Black whites. It is both warning and rebuke to those who have defended or who would defend Jim Crow. I'm going to close my remarks because, like I said, I would actually rather have you guys ask me questions than talk, with first just another picture that captures both the disillusion and the determination of the moment, this sense that like they've fought off discrimination and segregation in Chicago and they mean to do more. And then also, because I have a tendency to always tell people to go read more books, I'm going to recommend to you David Krugler's book about the violence of 1919, the year, which is actually called 1919, which is very smart and very thorough. Nan Woodruff's American Congo about the Arkansas Delta, which is incredibly powerful. And then this book by Eve Ewing, which I think is just lovely. Eve Ewing is, I remember she's a sociologist by training. She's written this other book called Ghosts in the Schoolyard, which is about Chicago and education and parents advocating for their kids' public education. But this particular book is actually her account and interpretation of the Chicago riots through poems. She's also a poet, and so it's a series of poems about Chicago. that draws from and is inspired by the Chicago Race Riot Commission report, which was written in the aftermath of the riot and then published in the early 20s, and which I think the text of which is available online. It's very long, very involved exploration of conditions and tensions within Chicago in this period. But her distillation, her placing this riot in history and memory, her connecting it to other moments of racial encounter and racial violence is really gorgeous and lovely, and I can't recommend it enough. So that's the cover. Her name is Eve Ewing, and with that, I will hush and see if I know how to stop sharing a screen, which is a big question mark. And then, ooh, did you just unshare me?
Unshared you.
Thank you, because I don't think I could have done that on my own.
I don't think you have the power.
All right.
Okay, any questions?
I think a little applause.
Okay. Well, I'll start off. Am I right in assuming that the labor tensions were kind of the mainspring of all of these riots?
So I would say yes and no, right? That there's in some of, like, you know, I pulled East St. Louis in, even though it's 2 years earlier, because I think it sets the terms for what wartime riots look like. And in many of the major industrial centers, somewhere along the way, it tracks back to either, you know, we don't want this influx of Black folks working with us, or we don't want the presence of the Black worker to somehow diminish our or hamper our sort of like rising to full-throated whiteness. Like, I think a lot of that is happening. But in some of the like sort of riots located in the Deep South, I say that pausing because I'm thinking Longview is a labor-related riot to some extent, but some of those riots in the South are not about labor conditions in that way, not tensions among laborers, right? Sort of like failing of class solidarity. The way that they are tied to labor is more about the extent to which Jim Crow or white supremacy as a system of political economy is always about controlling Black people and reframing them as Black laborers rather than citizens or anything else. So that's a like more abstract way of saying that it tracks back to labor. And I think distinguishing, like thinking more like pretty fine-grained about the dynamics in various places is important for us to understand. To not kind of, it's important for us not to elide everything into one big jumble,
Right.
and instead to think about the distinctions.
There are
Miriam, your sound is off, Miriam. You're muted.
I also was interested, so we don't collide one force like the labor, although it was significant, and immigration you point out. And by the way, thank you so much for your presentation. But also I was interested in the role of Black soldiers coming back and how there was tension already in France between Black and white soldiers, and the warnings when they come back not to expect the same freedoms. And I wondered also, I put it in the chat, but thanks to you and your references, your collegial references, and how important this history is. Is it being taught adequately or where is it being taught in our public schools and higher education, especially history's contribution to the January 6th? And we're always so devoid of history. And now it's just thanks to you, because I think we need to bring that history. Following up this wonderful conversation, we're trying to struggle to bring it into our local schools, our public schools, and certainly our universities. So I just wondered how you and your colleagues are working together to really make sure this history is much more ubiquitous.
I mean, so to start with that last question, I think that different faculty members do it in different ways.
Yeah.
Something that I've found tremendously important and energizing is to do, work with, say, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or sometimes the Durham Public Schools, but to do teacher training or teacher institute things. Teachers have to have these kind of, I don't think they call them continuing ed credits, but they do get credit for engaging in their own historical learning. And so making available to them like resources that kind of sit in the university, whether they be faculty knowledge or materials in the libraries or what have you, helps us carry kind of the way that we teach history out and to the public at large. The National Humanities Center, actually, which is located in RTP, has a wonderful educational outreach section run by a guy named Andy Mink. And they will sometimes do webinars with faculty from across the country, and then they archive those webinars so anyone can go and look at them anytime they want to, and those help. I also, my kids are in 4th grade and 6th grade, and so of an age where teachers are still asking parents to show up and talk about whatever expertise they have. And so I try to go and talk to the elementary schoolers about something, which resulted 2 years ago when my daughter was in 4th grade in a mixed 4th and 5th grade class, with me sort of helping the kids think about how to approach the landscape of Stagville when they went to visit Stagville Plantation, and having a little 5th grader raise her hand and say, "I have a question. Why is so much of history tragic?" And me having to figure out how you can't say to an 11-year-old, "Well, Shamana, it's partially because people have been very terrible over time," so like trying to figure out like how to keep them engaged and how to actually talk to them about the hard stuff without either talking down to them or completely alienating them. And I mean, to go back to, sorry, this is a very long answer to your question, but to go back to your observation that history continues to be a battleground, and that history fights over history and US history, which are ultimately fights over meaning, and the form of American civic or racial nationalism that we want, right? Those fights are so rooted in both matters of historical interpretation and of what facts are relevant. So the battle over the 1619 project versus the 1776 commission, right? Which, historians have criticized the 1619 project for, tilting too hard, slanting too hard, not playing up, X or Y over Y or Z, but those are kind of internal. They're not fighting about the facts of things. They're fighting about the interpretation or the emphasis on particular things over another. The 1776 commission was a response that was, we want you to stop talking about X. We want you to stop including other voices. The purpose of history is to feed our mythos of self, and not to know who we are, but to celebrate power, which is not the project of learning, right? And so to push, I think it's incredibly important for me, my colleagues, all academics and all citizens to push back on that, right? Like history isn't about heroes and villains, it's about the ugly contradictions of kind of people and their aspirations and their weakness, and how those can exist in the same people at the same time. And until you can deal with absurdity and irony and tragedy and pain, you're not sort of a grown-up thinker.
Oh. Yeah.
Betsy, turn audio.
Am I on? Thanks.
Yep.
I'm interested to know if you can tell us a little bit more about the training of Black soldiers in World War I. I know they must have been segregated, but were they sent anywhere for training before they were shipped out? Were they trained to do certain kinds of jobs only? And I assume there weren't any officers, but and they were all enlisted personnel. But what can you tell us? What I know is more about World War II, which was a very different situation.
World War II is bigger scale, and it's still like, in both cases, you're talking about these horrible ironies of people fighting on behalf of a country that refuses to acknowledge them as full-fledged citizens, right? And in both instances, the wartime experience will feed a post-war drive for civil rights. It gets crushed after World War I, but the experience of World War I puts the seeds in for people to do a better job with things in World War II, often the same people. There were Black officers in World War I, but not very many. There was a segregated officers training camp that trained, I think 1,300 folks went into the camp. I can't remember how many actually came out commissioned, but what they found was that they were usually not, once they were commissioned, put in charge of combat troops. They were put in charge of labor battalions. And many of them were kind of busted down the ranks because Army leadership was so opposed to having Black officers. Rayford Logan, who was an officer in World War I, who would go on to be an incredibly famous and important historian, wrote in his memoirs that he fought 2 wars at once, his own and Woodrow Wilson's, and he was never sure which one did more damage to him, right? So I describe him as having a kind of Jim Crow shell shock. I'm trying to, so there were roughly, I can't remember, the numbers are like 386, is that right? African-American soldiers during World War I. A tiny portion of those were members of the regular army. So folks we think of as Buffalo soldiers from the segregated 9th and 10th Cavalry, 24th and 25th Infantry. They, by and large, were just kept kind of on the outskirts of American empire, either in like Hawaii or the West or somewhere. They didn't bring them into the regular army. A few transferred out of those regular army units into the American Expeditionary Forces. There were few enlisted men, but not very many, again, because the Army was really ambivalent about African-American soldiering, and certainly didn't want the volunteer soldier, because it's hard to deny someone civil rights and draw on their military service at a time when kind of military service and citizenship were so tightly bound. And then there were a lot of draftees. There were a few leftover National Guard units. I mentioned the 8th Illinois National Guard, the 15th New York National Guard, also known as the Harlem Hellfighters, which had an incredible jazz band led by James Reese Europe, and then like a small company out of DC and a handful of other. But there were of almost 400,000 African-American soldiers in an army of 2 million, only 40,000 were combat troops. The other 160,000 were in labor battalions. Actually even more. So 200,000 were stateside, 200,000 went overseas, and of those, only 40,000 were combat troops. People did train in places away from home, so all over the country. And some of the stories of battles over segregation and civil rights domestically are about the tensions born when soldiers from the North go south to training camps. And the people in the receiving cities imagine those outside soldiers as being more trouble than their local folks, in part because it's always easy to blame foreign agitators, whether the agitation is coming from outside or not. But the war moved a lot of people around. And I think one of the reasons that you see increased energy afterwards for civil rights is because whether folks went overseas to France or whether they just, had spent their whole life in outside of Augusta, Georgia, and suddenly saw, Newport News, Virginia, people are coming to be aware that like the world doesn't have to look like the world that they know. And that can spark a lot of imaginative work that can become activist work in certain people, not everyone, but in some people.
Thank you.
We've got a few questions or a question from Maggie on chat. Let me read it. I hope Dr. Smith can tell us something about the other meaning of red for Red Summer, as the anti-communism was also very important and led to the deportation of over 300 Americans, including Emma Goldman. Do you have any comments about that? The two meanings of red here?
Yeah, so it's when I do this lecture in my 1898 to 1945 survey class, I just do of red summers and red scares in the same lecture. That the timing of the red summer and the timing of the red scare, they overlap. The red scare kind of picks up and intensifies in the latter part of the year, and it's as the sort of A. Mitchell Palmer's, the Palmer raids and the worries about communist subversion. Because we have to remember the Russian Revolution was 1917, right? It was 2 years before, and the freak out about communist subversion is really ramping up. And there's a way that in World War I, as we would see over and over again up through the Civil Rights Movement and J. Edgar Hoover's like fixation on Martin Luther King, there is a narrative in which certain authorities cannot imagine Black dissatisfaction with their circumstances as being generated by the circumstances. They assume again that there has to be some kind of foreign agitation. And so when you look at the files, be they military intelligence files or Bureau of Investigation files from this period, you see a lot of reports that are trying to figure out how the Reds have gotten the Negroes so worked up. And even in 1919, as ridiculous as it seems, some of those reports are already being written by J. Edgar Hoover. Like, you just can't get away from that terrible guy at any point over the 20th century. And I think the Elaine massacre, which I mentioned, is a moment where the Red Scare and the Red Summer really come together, because that one is framed as a plot, a kind of a communist or leftist plot to disrupt labor and social relations. And that's what authorizes the authorities to go so hard and so broad in killing people, arresting and killing people.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Ellie.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is just expansive of all of my knowledge, and I'm sure everybody's. I'm interested in the role of the press. We see the dominant press, the white press, whipping this all up. But the Black press, and most people, I don't think, know that there is a very vigorous and widespread Black press. I've been taking the Carolinian, which is a Raleigh Black press, for 30 years and really enjoy it. But I would wonder how much of your research comes for a different view of what the white press was saying, so that you could build the facts from the Black press or other sources. And I'm interested in what your sources are.
So a lot of it is the Black press. And in the DC riot, specifically the Washington Bee, the Baltimore Afro-American, which is a huge one with great circulation, the Chicago Defender, which circulates, which goes, it's a local paper with national reach, in part because Pullman porters carry the Defender into local towns. I didn't go into great detail about the sort of push and pull factors of the Great Migration, but part of it is that northern, factories and businesses and labor agents are urging people to move north. They're trying to fill these positions in northern cities. And so they put out ads in the Chicago Defender. I mean, some people actually travel down at great risk to themselves as things get heated up, but they put in ads in the Chicago Defender or other papers like this that say, come north. This is, the Defender again, better to die in a Chicago winter than at the hands of a Southern mob. But Southern, kind of landholders or, financial elite go from welcoming the migration of Black folks out, saying like, oh, fine, let it be the North's problem, to getting worried about losing their labor supply at some point. And so in some towns, the Defender gets banned, or other Black papers with that kind of reach get banned. So they're not allowed in the mails. And so the Pullman porters smuggle them in and leave them about town. And the porters are the best folks to do it because they don't have to stay, right? They can go, they can drop their thing, they hop on their train and they're out to the next town. Unlike people who might live there, who try to do that, who then have to face, an irate mayor or sheriff or what have you. I also really like the Cleveland Advocate because it's kind of tabloidy, which means that you get kind of wonderfully over the top sort of salacious stories that you wouldn't get in a more respectable paper. I mean, in the Black press, you have conservative, you have a little more out there, you have socially conservative, that's anachronistic, but you have kind of more politics of respectability versus a little bit looser, right? So you read papers enough to get a sense of their personality, which will tell you something about how they're being covered. The Crisis, which I mentioned, which is the NAACP's monthly magazine, is a wonderful source because it has Du Bois's kind of editorial writing, it's got wonderful fiction, but it also is where the NAACP publishes its investigations of certain incidents. Some of the most interesting of which have been investigated by Walter White, who I mentioned, who would eventually become the head, but in this period as a young man is going into places in the South and passing as white. Because if you saw Walter White, he's blonde haired and blue eyed, you wouldn't know if you didn't know that he was Black, And so he would say in the wake of I mentioned a lynching in Waco in 1916, in the wake of the lynching of Jesse Washington, I think it was, he went and asked all kinds of parties about how they were involved, what they did, sort of what set this off. And he did this in place after place, sometimes barely getting out before people figured out, getting out as people figured out that there was an NAACP agent somewhere in town and trying to figure out who it was. So those are some of the, I think, more fascinating, kind of important voices to counteract the sort of cataracts of white newspapers. I also really like letters and diaries because I'm nosy.
Dick,
Robert.
can I ask a quick question, or are we too late?
No, yeah, and
Okay.
then Robert.
Okay, Adriane, I'm just curious about your educational background and how difficult it is to be working in this area as your major research area.
So I became a historian because I had wonderful, wonderful junior high and high school teachers, and yet still got to college. And I was a Harvard undergrad and a history major. And I remember when my professor was trying to explain historiography to me, and he said, it used to be that we said the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but that's crazy. Nobody would say that anymore. And every kid in the room from the South kind of leaned back in their chair and looked at one another. And I was like, well, I mean, I knew it was about slavery, but I've never heard anyone validate, And so the kind of space between what documents and kind of common sense interpretations told me, and the narratives that, again, Miss Pierce, I love her dearly. She let me question everything, but she really was wedded to a kind of lost cause narrative, right? The space between those two things and the indignation at all that it left unknown was what sort of sent me into being a historian. I think it's actually a really rich and vibrant field because the sources are there. It's just that people haven't paid much attention to them. And where they aren't in the archive, depending on when you work, you can often get them by talking to people or reading things that folks have overlooked. And so it gives me a lot to work with, even as I'm kind of incredulous that things are so underutilized. I think emotionally, especially right now, especially for me this summer with the George Floyd protests, it can be a lot because there's nowhere to escape from the pain of the world. But it feels worthwhile. So I keep at it.
Robert, you get the last question.
Okay. One of your pictures has a picture of a excuse me, a black Chicago cop looking on. And I'm curious as to, has anybody worked on the history of the black police in the North?
You know, that is a fabulous question. And I don't know. And if they haven't, they totally should, shouldn't they? You know, like, and you can, not to pull it into now, but imagine trying to figure out like who the Eugene Goodmans are, right? So people who've done various forms of service within institutions that actually have built-in hostilities to them, but also have great historic meaning to their communities. Or I think, and this would be a kind of history, sort of a history of a contemporary moment almost, but all of the Black police chiefs right now in the North and in big Southern urban centers who are sitting atop police forces that they are slowly, I mean, ideally trying to change, but have so much embedded stuff that they can't. Like, what does it mean to move through that organization, become responsible for it, and then be the person in place when the broader public wants someone to have responsibility for all of the structural problems that are in place? I think that's a book. You should write that book.
First Black police were in the 40s, they could only arrest Black people.
Yeah, have you read that book Darktown, which is a like detective novel set in Atlanta, but it's actually about a Black police officer. It's almost like this kind of new Perry Mason, but with the guy who becomes, sorry, this is, but it is actually that story told, imagined through fiction. Also, hi.
Thank you.
Well, we've run out of time. Adriane, this has been truly, well, as Ellie said, it's just expanded our awareness greatly, and we're deeply grateful to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you guys for having and for sitting through. I know I talked a whole lot nonstop for a long time. I appreciate your bearing with me.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm shutting everybody down.
All right.